you have a real problem. And I want to point one other thing out too, that this is the next focus. I like to telegraph to the executive where we're going next, and so I'll just say it here. I'm looking at the graduation rates and the gender gap that exists in our graduation rates. There is a 16-point gender gap between young men and young women graduating. And in some of our high schools, it's 25, 26%. And so as we start to look at what's not working in our system, in the absence of looking at the data, I don't need a system-wide issue. If I know that I have a problem with young men, maybe I should have a focus there. And I need to deconstruct where this failure starts to emerge and create interventions to keep it from happening. But again, so it's just focus on everything all the time in a relentless fashion and not taking excuses.
I'm going to interject something. Just to follow up on what it is that makes a place like KIPP be successful. I think this is more a comment than a question, and then I have a question. But I think one thing to be aware of is when you start young, you can also inculcate a certain school culture.
Absolutely.
And that this is much harder to do system-wide in something as big as DCPS. If you have consistent expectations, consistent consequences from classroom to classroom, you don't have that within a DCPS school, let alone from one DCPS school to the next. It's much harder to do it at a middle school level. It's almost impossible at a high school level, the younger you get them. So I would urge you to just bear that in mind, because learning cannot take place if classrooms are disrupted, and that's often what happens. But I wanted to follow up on what you just said about the gender gap in the graduation rate. It reminded me of something about your proposal for this Promise Scholarship program, which would provide tuition aid up to as much as $100,000 for college. There's a sliding scale depending on how many years a child has spent in DC public schools, both traditional and charter, and family income. There were other programs like this in other places in the country, and I think maybe the original one was in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It had a somewhat different purpose and format, and there were some good results from it. It did draw more people into the schools, it reduced attrition, but it didn't apparently do much about closing the achievement gap or improving the graduation rate, especially for African American males. And you had mentioned, I've heard you mention the Washington State Promise-like program, and I haven't been able to find any information about that. So my question is, how similar is your program to the Washington State one, and do you have results from Washington State in terms of things like closing the achievement gap and increasing the graduation rate?
Thank you. So for African American women in Kalamazoo, there was a 6% increase in graduation rates from high school, which was important. Their 4-year completion rates were higher than on average in the state. So the students were graduating from high school in higher numbers, and they're graduating in 4 years in higher numbers. I think the Kalamazoo program was seen as a success in that it not only stabilized enrollment, but there were system-wide increases in standardized tests in the years that followed. But you're right, it was not a panacea, nor will this be. Okay? Kalamazoo is slightly different than what Kalamazoo offered scholarships for in-state opportunities in Michigan, and it has it succeeded in that goal. But it's different than what we are proposing. What we're proposing is modeled after College Bound in Washington State, which offers more resources. It doesn't tailor it to GPA, and perhaps the best way to do for me to explain what I intend to mark up tomorrow. Okay. That's a place to start. All right. So originally, you're right. We were looking at a very aggressive, very generous program, and the idea being we can always make things smaller. It's harder to start small and go big. It's easier to go big and then tailor it. And this is the way the bill will change. As originally introduced, it would only apply to charters and traditional public school students. And now I'll recommend that it apply to all high schools in the city. So parochial, private as well. So all students will have access. we've decreased the top award from a maximum of $20,000 a year to $12,000. So there would be $60,000 over the course of a low-income student's career. We've changed the numbers to reflect the AMI. So there's a certain amount available between 0 and 50% of average median income, and then 50 to 80%. And these are numbers we use for other things in the city, and then 80 to 125, and 125 to 200. And there's corresponding decreases in the amount that students are eligible for. Let me, if I can't say what the results they had in Washington State. In Washington State, they made it available only for low-income students, 120% of federal poverty and below. And they started the program in 2007. When they started the program, among low-income students, there was a 59% graduation rate. Today, for those students, low-income students enrolled in the program, it is 78%. So it went from 59 to 78%. That's a pretty significant increase, 19%. In Tacoma, which is a city that is demographically similar to Washington, when adding a college counselor to the mix, their graduation rates go to 90%, which is really incredible. And so what are the takeaways? For low-income students participating in College Bound, their graduation rates are higher than the state average. And in Tacoma, they're higher than their upper income peers. So what that tells me is that if you properly incentivize and guide students and give them the certainty of resources, that they may change their behavior. We have examples of it working in our own city with the DC College Success Foundation. They work with 5 high schools east of the river. These are funds that were donated by Microsoft and Costco. These dollars will end in 2017. And they're slightly smaller amounts, but you can see how they work. The opportunity to go to the college of your choice or to a school that you want to go to, not the one you get into, right? Or the one you want to go to, but the one you get into. It does have the effect of changing people's behavior. And again, I don't think there's any panacea, but I think it's an important step. Again, as I talk about, is reflecting back on what our common values are about equal opportunity and fairness. I think our institutions need to reflect that, and I think this program would do it.
You mentioned that over a third of the students that are most struggling in high schools are IEP students, specialized students. And yet, in Chancellor Henderson's speech on education, 2 words that she didn't say were special education.
Yeah.
The Hill Rag asked her about this, and she said she just didn't have enough time in the speech to get to. Do you think that DCPS is focusing enough on special education? If not, why not? What else do you think they could be doing?
So, total admission against interest. This is something that is on our plate and that we are learning about now. So let me share with you what we've decided, or how I've decided to approach this. Special ed is an incredibly sophisticated subject, from instruction to programming to the legal infrastructure that supports it, to the emotions associated with it. And it is not something that you jump into unless you have that expertise. So I've asked the Children's Law Center to assist us. They are perhaps the most aggressive group in the city on the subject of advocacy. They have shared with me a number of the concerns, including the number of days it takes for an IEP, the definition of special ed, et cetera, et cetera. And I've asked them to lead the effort to inform and work with the committee to look at what we might do to do better from a legal infrastructure, from a budget perspective. I've asked them to reach out to a number of our advocacy organizations and institutions to help have a big tent. And that includes St. Coletta's on one side and the lab school on the other, because we can learn a lot from both. And what I've asked is a pretty aggressive timeline. I want recommendations by January, which means everyone into January, which means everyone works around the clock. And then I want a proposal that we can begin a discussion with in February. And I just don't know another way of going about it. We just have to confront the issue, bring the experts to the table, throw a wide net, have all the ideas come under a proposal, and then take it before the public. But I think that's past time for a sense of urgency on the subject.
I think the gentleman
Yes, so thanks for coming tonight. We're on the eve of the FY15 budget cycle. And I have to tell you, last year's budget cycle, I thought DCPS's budget was the weakest component to the mayor's budget, and it was weak for several reasons. One, it was an opaque process. Two, it seemed like it was hastily prepared, and I gauged that by the fact that the school principals didn't receive it until we were given like 3 days to comment on it. And then three, I think it created a lot of false choices, and it seemed like in a city that was clearly had a surplus of cash, we were cutting budgets inside of DCPS. So, you know, the effort to put a language instructor in every elementary school was more on the backs of middle school language instructors. So it created these kind of false trade-offs. So on the eve of the FY15 budget, I know you have some bills, you've done some things. I'm curious though, how will the FY15 budget cycle be different? What are your priorities, and what are some specific budget marks that you kind of expect to inject into the budgeting cycle?
Thank you for that question. You know, not only are there choices that are made within a school, but there are also choices made within grades. And the way our educational campuses have been funded, you know, our educational campuses have not succeeded to the extent I would like them to, in part because choices often lead to resources being shifted down grades instead of upgrades. And so the 6th and 7th and 8th grades start to fail. And then it becomes self-fulfilling when the kids start to flee the educational campuses. Then you've got a problem with educational campuses then, you know, having too few 6th, 7th, and 8th graders unable to support the high school above it, which is the case at Eastern, not at Eastern, but at Roosevelt, where we have 63 students who are in the 8th grade combined at West and at Truesdale, thank you. Truesdale and West. Truesdale has 3 8th grade classes, West has 1. How do 63 kids fill 1,000 high school? You see what I mean? So there are consequences. Those funding decisions have consequences up the food chain. So this is what I expect in this year's budget. We had first reading on this measure I mentioned on Tuesday on the fair funding. It also includes reform of how DCPS budgets. So the program areas have to now, the way DCPS budgets now, a pile of money is put in the system, and there are codes that are given to us, but they don't align with how DCPS spends the money from an organizational perspective. So you need to be able to cross-read, right? So we're looking at budget alignment that is more transparent, that requires, as a part of the budget process, that each of the individual schools' budgets be calculated individually. And so a parent doesn't need to crosswalk and figure it out. They can go to their budget and see. This is part of the budget process. As far as here's the tension about how we spend the money. We're currently organized on a personnel system. We fund personnel choices in DCPS. The money doesn't follow the students, right? And so you'll have a situation where you'll have an elementary school or middle school or high school, and because there's a staffing model, the principal has very little discretion on what to do with that money. They have to fund those positions. And this is particularly onerous on special education if the money doesn't follow the child and they get the short end of the stick. And so how we try to blend, you know, flexibility and autonomy for principals with the chancellor's right desire to have a staffing formula, we decided to split the baby and allow the continuation of the staffing model. But these new resources that will accompany the at-risk designation, these funds will be left for the principals to decide. And the principal will be required to draw up a plan and share with the public and explain how these additional resources will be used to narrow the achievement gap or to address the underlying issues. Now, the chancellor can ultimately override, but my hope is the law requires the chancellor or the principal to work with the faculty and the school community on how these dollars could be used. And then the last question was of Mark, how much? I agree. You know, this city is in a state where, you know, we're accepting money into the treasury almost as fast as we can count it. And every year we have record surpluses after we're told that it's going to be a lean year. And we have to decide whether or not we're going to invest in public education or not, and whether or not we're going to continue to cut corners. I would hope that we will see a minimum of a 10% increase in the underlying basic per pupil formula. That's what the adequacy study indicates is necessary. And then money on top of that for the at-risk. Now, I don't object if the mayor wants to measure it in over time, over 1, 2, or 3 years, because the system may not be able to absorb a whole lot of expenditures all at once, so we want to be prudent about it. What I do hope, however, is that whatever increase we get doesn't all get assumed by increases in salaries, because that can happen. And all of a sudden, one hand you get a bunch of new money, and then the next hand, congratulations, you stay where you are. And so, part of having the at-risk funding formula come outside of the traditional way is a way to keep those dollars harmless from pay increases. Okay?
Yeah, you have another question.
So, might be a little unfair since you're having a hearing on this in 2 days, but we haven't talked specifically yet about early education.
Okay.
Both pre-K and childcare, and how can we, as a city, improve the quality of those things so we're not sort of playing a game of Jenga with the educational system.
This is, so we have a measure in 2 days on compulsory education, and there's one also on pre-K. And, what I hear from the principals from pre-K 3 and pre-K 4 are often the following. These are the things I hear. That often parents won't show up. That they view pre-K 3 and 4 as, as kind of a form of daycare. And so kids don't come. And so, what does that mean for the kids that do? And what does it mean for the kids who don't have a space in the program because someone else is taking it up? And then what happens when, because 3 and 4 is not required, you have kindergartners showing up who don't know their colors, and they're in, the same kindergarten class with kids who are reading. I mean, there is disconnect all over the place. So, we have to decide whether or not we're going to extend compulsive education to 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. And, I think it's a discussion that we're not ready to have right now because we don't have the infrastructure for it. Notwithstanding the fact that we hear all the time how we have universal pre-K, we do not have universal pre-K. That is not true. Okay? We have a lot of spaces and we're spending a lot of money on it and we should be congratulated for it, but we do not have universal, high-quality pre-K 3 and 4. So it's hard to make it compulsory until such time as we have the infrastructure. So what do we do with the 3 and 4-year-olds? And this is not the majority by any stretch, but many parents are using it as a form of daycare, and for whom going every day isn't appropriate. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about high truancy among 3 and 4-year-olds. Well, you can't make it illegal if it isn't compulsory. So what do we do about that? I have a particular idea that I'm hoping we can have a conversation about, and that is informed by teachers and principals that have given me suggestions along the way. And I had an excellent suggestion about simply if you miss a certain number of days, you forfeit your space and you free it up for someone who wants it. That seems to be a fair compromise. It's not, subjecting the parent to criminal prosecution, and at the same time it's not continuing to waste a scarce and valuable public resource. So that's something we'll be talking about. But how do you get around the fact that you've got, and by the way, what our students are capable of, will blow the average kind of, person's expectations away. To see, I was at a recent graduation ceremony over the summer, where every member of the pre-K 4 class read on stage, in front of 250 plus parents at a Ward 7 school. So, the notion that we don't care about our kids is a lie. The notion that our kids won't rise to the level of expectation is a lie. But what do you do with folks who've had Miss Mason and are graduating to kindergarten and can read, sitting in the classroom in kindergarten with a child who doesn't know the color? I don't know the answer to that. But that kind of illustrates what is happening a lot at our middle schools. We've got kids who are really ready to succeed in schools that aren't. And it happens in our high school. How do we address that? That is worthy of a broader conversation.
What time do we have?
I think we just have about 5 minutes, so just maybe 1 or 2 more.
Two more questions? You've been very patient.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
As the mayor, if you decide, we live in a city where we have 2 systems in one city. What are your plans to merge or communicate charter schools with DCPS in order to alleviate the communication barrier and actually understand why charter schools are outperforming so many schools in DCPS? And also, even though they have total autonomy as far as what they're able to do, the curriculums that they choose, I think that there needs to be some type of communication so that we all can be on the same page. Because in the end, we're only hurting the children.
I think that's right. So how do we integrate? At the moment we have 61 separate local education agencies. So DCPS is one, and of course it's the most significant, and then we have 60 others. And one of the things I've learned from just traveling and visiting with school leaders is that there really isn't anyone in our government that's doing this, that's talking to all systems and trying to figure out now what is working here and what isn't. What I often find interesting among the 60 LEAs that are charters, not all of them have the resources they need to succeed, and there's no place for them to go to get answers, right? And so it might make sense for our Office of the State Superintendent of Education to act as a clearinghouse for all 61 local education agencies on what works, from curriculum to technology, to support the 61 LEAs. Number one. Number two, I think simply getting the system, the charter schools to come out of their shells, because there has been a culture within charter schools that that they have shied away from engaging the city because it will encroach upon their autonomy. And I think a system where we have trust among the 61 LEAs that we're not going to retrade this bargain. You have autonomy. We're here to set you up to succeed, and we can build trust to help them succeed. But I think charters also have, there's some vertical integration issues where we and the traditional DCPS system have an advantage. You can build with the facilities at pre-K through 12 excellent experience in the community. Often you have charters that are an elementary or a middle or a high school, and how do they feed in? It may not be an official organizational feeding in, but it is conversation and knowledge about what's coming and exposing parents to what their options are.
One more question?
Yay, that's a good question. Kind of related to that, to be transparent, I went to DL graduate Banneker, and I worked at a charter school in Town Street, Nightcap. And what I believe part of our success is that we invest a ton in character development, that culture piece that you were speaking about. We have people hired specifically to develop children's character and to work with parents. I'm curious as to whether, Councilman, in your travels around the city, you've observed schools or roles within DCPS, even given the new budget cuts, that you would replicate.
In terms of culture?
Yeah, if you've seen perhaps dean of students or assistant principals dedicated to culture and character development, if you have even a school psychologist or a school counselor who spends 100% of their time focused on developing strong character and culture that allows the excellent learning to take place in the classroom.
The college counselor at Banneker is excellent.
She got me into college.
Her name begins with an A.
Mine was Ms. Jefferson.
No, it is her. I'm sorry. It is Miss Jefferson.
Regina Jefferson. She's been there for 20
Yeah, that's
years.
right. I'm sorry. And I actually watched her in action. I think she's extraordinary. The principal at Anacostia, Ian, the way that he is instilling discipline and order and not from an authoritarian perspective at Anacostia, but from a series of expectations. I think he is excellent. We've spent a lot of time talking about the problems and challenges facing DCPS and our public schools generally. There's a whole lot more to be optimistic about, candidly. And I think, often schools face constraints, and one of the first things to go, happens to be counselors, right? It's in the staffing model. There are not always enough of them. In terms of charter schools, the work that is done, Kip does a great job, but boy, Thurgood Marshall and their college counselor is just about the best I've seen, right? And it's about building bonds and showing kids that you're there to support them and to see them succeed, and they believe it, and they trust you. Kids are really smart. They know when you're in it for a paycheck versus when it's a calling, right? We have a lot of examples where we, as a system, could set our whole selves, our entire city up to succeed. But it's just going to require a little more attention, a little more time, some resources, and a belief that we can do it.
And I would push us to look at the elementary model as well. School counselors at the high school level are critical in getting students into college. Those school counselors or dean of students or school psychologists or someone dedicated 100% to developing character and making sure that teachers as well reinforce those character expectations expectations at the elementary level, set children up to go on to high performance schools, which bring those skills to a middle school that may not be ideal, but could be with those students who have those abilities.
I think while counselors are important, I think that the tone is set from the top. The tone is set from the principal. And, as I think of, as my mind races around the city where, this is not Pollyannish when I say that of the principals that I've visited, I'm incredibly impressed with the caliber of people that we have. Now let's give them the chance to succeed. And, and not all of our schools are coming from hard knocks circumstances. A good many are. And so we have to differentiate, and that's part of the at-risk funding level. But I think there's a great deal to be optimistic about, and we could spend a whole other program, hopefully we'll have another one, on the great things that we're doing, whether it's Wilson's robotics program, which is extraordinary. If you haven't seen it, you should. It's really incredible, one of the best in the country. To see, how that actually, lures kids in, to see the robotics club and how it lures kids in, how they stay after school. And there's just one example after another. Banneker as a high school is incredible. Walls, I have to confess, those kids are so smart, they'd make coffee nervous. I mean, seriously, it is really incredible to see and to go and hear them talk about their senior projects and how they got the idea. I mean, these kids are, I'll say they're better than me. I mean, they're better than us in terms of their intellect, their capacity to understand what's important. I mean, I leave these school visits feeling more often than not incredibly optimistic. What leaves me feeling a bit, aware of the challenges ahead of us, again, I'll go back to, Cedar Tree. When I look at at these kids who are so promising and they face the same barriers their parents faced, and unless we do something differently, their lives and circumstances will replicate their parents. And so we can continue to do things as we've done them, or we can do better, realizing that we might not get it perfectly right the first time, but it has to be the top priority of our city.
All right, well, did you have one more?
There's one more from Twitter if you want to. It's kind of a juicy one.
Well, I don't know if they're going to kick us out, but it's hard to resist that. Is that okay with you to try one more?
This is from DC Voter, and the question is, why can't the per pupil funding formula finance private school vouchers? Hashtag school choice. Sorry, why can't the per pupil funding formula finance private school vouchers?
We have a federal program that offers vouchers. And I've had a number of kids who are the recipients of the vouchers come and testify, for instance, on the DC Promise Bill. And at the moment, there just isn't the will to, or the interest, candidly, in creating a private voucher system. I think we have our hands full with a system that creates 61 local education agencies and 2 distinct systems. Introducing more choice into the system, I think, could be further destabilizing.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks especially to Councilmember Catania
Thank you all very much for your